Hey guys, welcome to this week's tutorial, which is going to be primarily about file input and file output, which is actually a really important topic to cover in Python. And it's a really important topic in this course too, because it's going to come up in a lot of questions in future assignments. So the content you guys will learn is going to end up being mixed in with file input and file output, and you'll have to use file input and file output in combination with the questions that you're going to end up doing. So it's really important to know what you're doing here. So let me start sharing my screen. Cool. And I've outlined a small basic plan here, which is the same as everybody else's plan, the other TAs for this week. And what we're going to be doing is practicing with some basic file input, file output. So I believe, can anybody tell me if Mr. Moore has actually covered any of the file input, file output operations in class? Or is it going to be your first time seeing it during this lecture? And yeah, I can zoom in. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and guess that maybe you guys have not seen it. So that's okay. I'll actually bring in a tab. Just like this. Okay, cool. So, what I really find helpful is actually Python's documentation has a lot of really useful details. So obviously you can learn from using resources like Tutorial Point and Geeks for Geeks and W3 Schools. I'm sure you guys might have seen those websites if you've Googled any Python questions or programming questions, but the actual official Python documentation is actually really helpful too. So we might end up referring to this very soon. Let's take a look at the first thing we want to do. So ignore this part. This is obviously for me. But the idea is that if I go back out here, you'll see that here in our folder, right? Let's say this notebook that I was working on is this one, yeah? So I'm in a folder, and in that same folder, we have a limerick.txt file. And if we open this limerick.txt file, we're going to see its contents. So it's just a limerick or some sort of poem. And you can see that there are new lines at the end of each of these lines. Even if we don't see them, there's technically a new line character because that's what makes each of these new lines appear. So we can use file input and file output in Python to extract the contents of this file and then operate on them with Python functions and Python operations. So if we go back over to our tutorial notebook, I'll show you guys the basic gist of how that might happen. So let's say we have a function called limerick, right? It doesn't take in any inputs, and we'll just put pass in for now so it doesn't do anything. And let's say we call this function. Cool, so what are we going to do inside limerick? Well, for starters, let's just see what's inside the file. And if you go over to our documentation and we search up read, you'll see here we have a section for reading and writing files, which is exactly what we want to do. So open is a function that returns a file object, and it's most commonly used with two arguments, which is the file name and the mode. And you can see here that both of these are used as strings. So hopefully that's big enough for you guys to see. But these are both strings, and this is the file name and this is the mode. And the modes that you can use are, there are a few. There are, as you can see here, R for the reading mode, which is when you can only read from the file. W is for when you want to write to the file. And A is for when you append to the file, which just means adding stuff to the end of the file only. And then you can also use R+ if you want to both read and write to the file. But the general idea is that you should just use whichever mode you know you're going to use, you're going to need. So let's go back. We can copy this, for example, and go back, and we know we're going to have some sort of we can make this a bit more explicit. We can call it my file, and we know that the file name, right? If we go back over here, it's limerick.txt. That's the file name that is in the folder. So since it's in the same folder as the notebook, we can just put the file name itself, and we'll actually be able to access its contents without specifying the path, since it's in the same folder. And since we're going to be reading from it, we can just use an R here. And now that we've done this, we have access to the contents of the file. And so if we keep on looking, we can ignore some of this stuff. Methods of file objects. So now that we have the file object, right, which is my file, that's what we defined over here, this now holds a file object. So what can we do with that file object? Well, there is a method called read, and that read method belongs to file objects. So what you can do is you can call read, and it will output a string containing the full contents of that file. And if it's multiple lines, you'll see that it actually explicitly shows the new lines in there. Whereas readLine is a little bit different. ReadLine will actually return a iterable, readLine will read one line at a time of the file, but readLines, which is another function, will return all of the lines right here as a list. So if you want to read all the lines of a file in a list, you can also use readLines. So let's take a look at how that would work, right? So what would happen if we just use the read command that I showed you guys, right? Let's run this. Okay, no such file or directory, limerick.txt. Did I spell it right? I do think I spelled it right. Give me 1 second. txt. Yeah, I definitely spelled it right. So let's see if it's, maybe if we save in checkpoint, maybe we refresh this, try and run it again. It's still not found. Good question, Ju. Open can read certain types of files. So it depends on the contents, right? If the file contains ASCII content, which is just text, right, like plain text, you'll definitely be able to read it. It can also read special types of content, like CSVs, which are comma-separated value files. That's the kind of stuff that you see in Excel spreadsheets. And there's actually special modules that are specifically designed to deal with those files too. So you'll be able to see a lot of those very soon. I just want to try and figure out what's going on here. Okay, I think I know what's wrong, and it's a little bit funny, but give me 1 second. I think I'll just fix it real quick. So I think I forgot to actually bring, yeah, this is the one that we want. So we're going to shut this down. We're going to go back to it. We're going to rename, or actually we're going to move it to T02. Now if we go back, yeah, so I had the wrong file in here. But now we can actually run this. We save this, we restart it, and let's just reopen the file to make sure that it's the correct one, like that. Okay, let's try again. Awesome. Okay, well, it ran, and it ran fine without raising an error. So let's actually try and view this content that we've just read. So let's do content equals myfile.read, and then we can also print that content too. And look at that. You can see that we can actually see the output here. And when we use the print command in Python, it actually interprets new lines and displays them it takes the new lines and actually interprets them. So it'll show you guys each line separated by the new lines. But if you just viewed the actual raw output of this file, if we did return content, you'll see that the actual output is just one big string with these \n's, and those are the new line characters, right? Mixed in. So the print command actually formats those for you, but this is the real output that you're going to be dealing with when you use the read command. So that's content. What if we said lines equals myfile.readLines, right? That's another one of the functions that we just looked at over here, right? Read line and read lines right there. So let's go back and let's say lines. And let's not read. Cool. So now you can see what happens. Now we actually have a list, and this is one entry in the list. Each of these entries are strings, right? They're all strings, and they're separated by a new line, which is the important bit. So now we have each line of our file as a distinct element in a list. So this is really useful. So this shows you guys how to read files, and obviously we can manipulate this content now that we have it. Let's take a look at what the actual question asked us originally. The question asked to write an algorithm that read the file, added prepended line numbers, followed by a tab character to the string, and then wrote it into a second file. So you can see here that basically what we need to do is we need to have a second file. Let's call it output file, and we can open it and we can say output.txt. And obviously this one's going to be in write mode because we're going to be writing to this output file. It's going to start off non-existent. As soon as we run this, it's going to create a file. And once we start writing to it, it will actually add content to this file that we create. So let's go back and take a look at the writing commands. So as you can see back here, we have our output command, which is f.write. So f here is obviously any file, like I said earlier, any file object, which you obtain by using this. These open commands return file objects. So this is now a file object, this is now a file object, right? So with a file object, you can write. And as an argument to the write method, you can pass in a string. And when you actually write something, it will add that to the actual file. So we're not going to need read. We can use purely read lines. So let's say we had read lines, and now that we have each of the lines, and also let's forget about this return statement. We don't really need that. Let's do what the question tells us to do. So for every single line, we need to add a line number and a tab to the beginning, and then write it to the second file. So we can say for line in lines, and let's make a counter for this for these line numbers, because we want to have line numbers next to each one of these, and we're going to start at 1 because lines will start at 1. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so for line in lines, we're going to say, what should we say? Let's say output file, and we're going to write to it. Now this write method takes in a string, so we're going to need the number, so it can be the counter. But we need to cast this as a string, obviously, in order to use it for a string concatenation, because this write only takes in a string, right? So it's going to be the counter plus a tab, which is represented by the \t. So those are the main two formatting characters that you guys should know. It's the new line, which is \n, and the tab character, which is \t. And both of those formatting characters, when they're actually interpreted, they actually create what they are supposed to represent. So a new line character will create a new line, and a tab character will actually create a tab. So we have the counter string, and then a tab, which we add on to that. And then finally, we can actually add in the line. So that's great. And what else should we do? And of course, we should update our counter so that for each line, counter goes up by 1. And another important thing, which I'm sure is mentioned down here, they say if you're not using the with keyword, which we're not using, then you should call f.close to close the file and immediately free up any system resources used by it. So basically, if we're opening files in this format, we should also remember to close them. Like this, we should also remember to close them, which means that after we're done writing to the file down here, we can say output file.close and myfile.close. And forgetting to close this doesn't have any immediate consequences. It's not a big deal. But it's just good practice, which you guys should always do because it frees up system memory. And if you leave too many of these open, you might find that Python begins to get a little bit slow because your kernel has too many resources open at once. So with that being said, we have our function here. Let's try and run it. So you can see here that our function ran. Let's go back to our folder, and you'll see now that seconds ago, there was a new file added to our folder called output.txt. And that's exactly what we defined as a file that we were opening in write mode. So let's open it up and take a look at the contents. And there you go. You can see here that we have line numbers in the text. This is a tab character. That's how Jupyter Hub shows tab characters. In something like Notepad, this would actually just be a tab, so like a really big space. And then we have the line. So that's pretty basic, but it's a good introduction to how to use Python input and output with files and how to read and write. And once again, guys, this read lines method is going to be one of the more important ones. You're typically going to find yourself using this a lot more than just the regular read, because you very frequently in programming, you want to operate on each line individually rather than the whole file individually, especially when you're working with something like CSVs or something that contains actual data that you want to parse, because very typically in those files, each record or each data entry is on its own separate line. So that's why this is going to come in very, very handy very soon enough. So if anybody has any questions about this function that we just wrote, feel free to let me know. What's going on here? Let's say yes. Okay, I think. All right, let's save. Cool, we're good. So assuming no more questions about this one, if I see any, I'll get to them. We can move on to the next bit, which is really a cool one. And here, you guys can read it. So basically this problem is called silly words, and we have a file, which is a CSV file, which contains a table of words and some stats about the words. So here are all the different stats that we get for each word. We get its name, how many times it's been used, its rating, and a Boolean value which tells us whether or not the queen thinks it's funny. So basically the whole point of this function is that we want to find the funniest word out of all of the words that are given to us. And the problem gives us some conditions to constrain ourselves in order to find out what the funniest word in the whole list is. So this function that we write is going to select the single funniest word from the whole CSV file and return it as a string. And here's how you find out which word is the funniest. So immediately, a word is not funny unless the queen thinks it's funny. And this means that you can automatically rule out every single word in that file which has royal assent set to false. Because if it's false, then the queen does not think it's funny, which means it's disqualified from being the funniest word. And then to calculate a score for how funny it is, we multiply the number of times a British comedian has used it by 5, and then divide by the rating that's given to it by Canadians. So basically, we would have usage times 5 divided by rating. And that's the score of this word. And obviously, if this above calculation fails for any reason, it can't be the funniest word. And just briefly on this, guys, as soon as you see this, if the above calculation fails, you should already be thinking about what possible way that above calculation could fail. I just told you that this above calculation is usage times 5 divided by rating. There's only one real way that that calculation can fail, and by fail I mean raise an error. The only way this is going to raise an error, and it's because we're dividing, right? It's usage times 5 divided by rating. That division is what could give us an error, and I'm sure many of you guys already know by now, but it'll happen if we divide by 0. So if rating, which is our denominator, ends up being 0, a score of 0, then this calculation for the score would fail. It would raise a 0 division error. So the instructions tell us that if it fails, it will not be the funniest word. It can't be. So we disqualify that too. And then by the end of the whole process, the word with the highest score, as calculated here, is the winner. And that is what we want our function to return. So if you guys have any questions about the actual question itself, before we start coding it, feel free to ask those. And yeah, I guess I can start coding it. If you guys wanted to try it on your own, you can feel free to do that. But I will be going over my thought process right now. So if you're doing it yourself, you can always mute the stream and then come back when you're done. But we're going to start coding now using the input-output operations that we've already learned in the past. Cool. So let's define our, yep, that's the one. This is our function. Oops. And we're obviously going to have that, and we're going to call funniest word. And I mentioned earlier, someone asked, about reading CSV files, and now we're actually reading a CSV file. And it turns out that there is, like I said, a module for reading CSV files, and that is the CSV module. So you can import CSV just like you'd import math, and you can start using the methods that it provides to you. So let me actually pull up the real quick. Sorry, I'm just pulling up the CSV. There we go. Sorry about that. Cool. So this is the documentation for CSV. Just like I said, the documentation for Python is really, really useful. And it's going to show you guys what the different methods you can use for CSV are. So I'm not going to go too into depth about what those are, but you guys will be able to go into depth afterwards if you guys want to yourself and find out more about the CSV module. For now, let's just assume that you guys know some of them, and I'm going to show you guys which ones I would actually use and how I'm going to use them. So the main one that we're going to use is actually just the reader, and that's just over here. And the reader just basically gives you back some sort of file which you can iterate over. So you can actually use that to go over what files you want to, or sorry, what lines you want to operate on. And I can demonstrate that here. So let's say we had a file. We can say file. Let's call it my CSV again. And we'll say, we can just open that in the regular way as a CSV. So if you guys take a look at our folder, it's called sillywords.csv. So we can copy that over. And of course, once again, we're going to be opening it in read mode. And my CSV file. And here, in order to get the lines of this file, obviously we can't use read lines because read lines is meant for files that contain text. And a CSV file, while it is a line that technically contains text, we can actually use the CSV module to give us a bit of a better format to work with those lines. And that's just by passing in the file that we create to the CSV reader. And this is explained over here in the documentation. But basically, this spits back out the lines that we would need. And let's actually take a look at the lines and see what we're working with. So if we open this CSV file, we see that we have all of these comma separated values. And you can see that the first line up here is actually a header. And this is very common in CSV files. In fact, it's almost always there. There's always usually a header which tells you what each column represents. So we see that it's name, then usage, then the rating, then royal assent. And so when we want to process this file, we don't want to use this header line because it's going to get in the way, right? So we can just ignore it. And the way we can do that is just like this. If we go over here, in our for loop, let's say we had for line in lines. Instead of saying lines, right, we can just say lines at 1 to the end. And this will basically start us off at 1 to the end. So let's comment that out. And for the sake of showing it off, we can say print lines from 1 to, or actually let's just print all of lines first. Oops, without this. So it's actually a CSV reader object, which means we would have to cast it as a list, I believe. And here we go. You can see that we get all of these lines right here. So if we added a slice and started from 1, oops, put it in the wrong spot, it should be over here, because we have to use this slicing after we've cast it to a list. We have to use this on the list itself, not on the CSV object. We get this, which is the exact same thing, but it's missing the header, which is perfect. All right, let's keep going. So we know now that this is what we want to do. Just like that. And what are we going to need to do? Well, we're going to have a winning word, and we're going to have a score that we keep track of. And basically, I'm sure you guys remember, but the idea for finding the largest of something in a group is basically to keep track of what the largest one is so far, right? Like the current maximum. And then you keep updating that as you go over the list. So you iterate over every element, and if you find one that is larger than your current maximum, then you make that one the newest maximum, aka you update your current maximum, and by the end of all the iteration, your current maximum will be your total maximum. That's the kind of idea of finding the maximum in a list. So we can actually do the same thing with score, because basically what we want to do is we want to calculate a new score for every single word that we encounter, and we want to keep track of what our current maximum for that score is. And every time we calculate a word that has a score higher than our current maximum, then we update the winning word, and we update our highest score. So let's define a initial winning word. Actually, let's do that after we've actually operated on our file. Actually, let's do this too. Let's cast this as a list, so that way we don't need to cast this as a list. A little bit more helpful. Here we can say winning word, which is the word that we're going to return. So since you know we're going to return it, we can already put that return statement in here, just so we know what we're doing. We can do that down here. Let's initialize it as, we could initialize it to an empty string, but let's say that we initialize it to the first word in our list. So that would be, and you know what, I'm actually no, I'm going to say that is going to be lines at 1 at 0, because we basically want the, so this is a nested list, and keep in mind that here we haven't yet actually done this 1 to 0, so we actually still have the header. So we want to ignore the header, so we're going to use 1 to target the second list in the nested list. So we're going to be looking at this one, and then we want to do 0 so that we look at the first element in that list, which is this word. So here we're going to say select the first funny, or the first word in our CSV. Cool. And let's also say our highest score, or highest score so far, can be 0. Or we can even say it's max score, right? That's maybe a more accurate representation. Actually, no, I like highest score. Cool. So now what we can do is we know that the first thing we got to check is make sure that the queen actually likes this word, right? So right off the bat, for every single line, we can say if, and which one of these is the queen? It's the fourth one. So this is line at 0, line at 1, line at 2, line at 3, right? So we'll say if line at 3 is equal to true, then we can actually consider it. Well, what are we going to do to consider it? We're going to calculate its score. So we're going to say line at 1, which is its usage. I believe it's its usage, right? Yeah, it's its usage, times 5, divided by its rating. So that is line at 2, right? That's this one. That's its Canadian rating. And after we've calculated a score, we can see if the score is higher than our highest score so far. And if it is higher than our highest score so far, then we update our highest score to that score, and we update our winning word to the word that we're looking at right now. So that would be line at 0. Awesome. And we're going to return our word at the end. So I wrote a very naive implementation which has some mistakes here. And I did it on purpose because I want to illustrate to you guys what some of the common problems you might run into are when you go to do this kind of thing with file I/O, especially with reading in data and using that data. So what would happen if we ran it right now? The first error that we'd run into is unsupported operand type for division, string and string. What it's basically saying is this ends up being a string. This ends up being a string. Some of you guys might say, oh, shouldn't this not work either since you're multiplying a string by a number? And it's actually kind of funny. If you try and multiply a string by a number, it'll actually work. If you multiply the string ha by 5, you would get ha, 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 right? You would get 5 ha's in a row. So multiplying strings by numbers just works in the same way that string concatenation does, right? So it works in the same way that addition does, but it's just multiplied. So you guys should be able to see that the main issue here is the fact that these are still strings. And we want to do math with them, which means we don't want to have them as strings. We want to have them as numbers. So you can see that our sillywords.csv, these are all integers. None of these are float values, which means that we can cast them all as integers. So right here, we can cast this as an integer, just like that. And we can cast this as an integer, just like that. And now we're actually doing math with these real numbers. So now it'll take the number, multiply it by 5, and divide by the number as well, where this is obviously usage and this is rating. And now we say if score is greater than highest score, blah, blah, blah. Cool, let's try it again. And here we go. Now we get a zero division error. And that brings us back to the instructions. We said that if the above calculation fails for any reason, it can't be the funniest word. So, what do we know from, I believe this is either last tutorial or the week before that, we covered exception handling and how to deal with errors and how to control them in a way that we tell the compiler what to do in the event of an error instead of letting it crash the program. And if you guys remember, that was dealing with try excepts. So we can use a try block to try a certain line of code, or to try many lines of code. In this case, it's just this line. And in the event that it doesn't work, we can do something. So in the event that it doesn't work, and let's actually specify that we're talking about zero division errors. We don't have to, but we can. Here I'm saying, in the case of a zero division error, let's continue. And what continue does, it's one of the two operations you can do for a loop. It just moves on to the next iteration. So right away, as soon as it hits this, it's just going to jump back up and go to the next iteration of this loop, which means it's not going to run this code, which is perfect. And here, after we've handled the zero division error, we can handle any other errors, and there shouldn't be any other errors, which means that in theory, we should never actually get to this part of the code. So here we're going to say, like, uh-oh, this is like a problem, right? An error other than zero division happened, which should not occur, right? Yeah, so obviously we don't want that to happen, but in the case that it does, at least we'll know about it and we'll know that our program is broken. So that's good. And then obviously, if this try succeeds, that is, this line runs without raising any errors, then we're going to jump over all of these except blocks and we're going to go right on and continue the code, which is going to be this part. Cool. So that should be totally fine. Let's try it again. And right away, you can see that we have an output. And this output is one of the words in string form, just like we were asked to return. And supposedly, if our function worked correctly, which I can tell you that I do think it does work correctly, then this would be our funniest word. And let's go over to our CSV file and try and find it just for fun. It's like pill something. Here it is. Yep, this makes a lot of sense because we actually divide by the rating that Canadians give it, right? So since this gets multiplied by 5, we end up getting something like 220 divided by 1, which is a score of 220. And that's makes a lot of sense because all of these divisions are a lot higher than 1. So, and also you can see here that the queen does like it. She thinks it's funny, which means that this most certainly is the funniest word, which means that our function is correct. So, that's pretty much it for this whole tutorial. Is yeah, doing what we just did. Obviously, I'm gonna save this and upload it to Avenue. But if you guys have any questions about what we did today at all, or any questions regarding anything else about the course, such as assignments or anything like that, feel free to ask. And yeah, I'll hang around for the next 10 minutes and answer any questions people might have. But that's all for the content today. So thank you guys for coming. And if you have no questions, then I'll see you guys next week.